the flagship program in this state, right? And
a bullshit, a bullshit, a bullshit, a bullshit.
It gets me every time. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another live edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports, preseason edition, Thursday, August 15th, just over 2 weeks from kickoff of week 1 of the 2024 college football season. God, I can't even describe how excited I am. We're here, though. I'm live from Houston, Texas, 9 p.m., Thursday, August 15th, for another SEC team previews and Texas personnel preview edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. Make sure you're checking out all of our content under the live section of our YouTube channel, along with on our Instagram and on our Twitch, where you can find all of our live content, all of our past episodes of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports, where we talk a lot of college football. And joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Emmy Nixon. What's up, Emmy?
Just getting kind of, I don't know, just thinking about this Christian Clark injury from this past week, which we'll get into later in the show, I'm sure. But that's been on my mind, and I felt like mentioning that right off the bat, getting that conversation out of the way might be the way to go because we have a lot to get to tonight. But torn Achilles, out for the season, second scholarship running back to go down in training camp.
Yeah, it's brutal luck. The C.J. Baxter injury. And before we go any further, I forgot to mention, make sure you like the show. It helps our algorithm, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. The C.J. Baxter injury was a contact injury, from my understanding. It happened on a tackle. The Christian Clark injury, from what I understand, was non-contact ruptured Achilles. To a certain extent, if you're Texas, you can't control it. So it's kind of unfortunate. If these injuries weren't going to occur, if the C.J. Baxter knee injury wasn't going to occur in training camp, it might have happened later on the season. Some of these things are just not in your control. But what this does, in my opinion, because obviously we viewed C.J. Baxter as an impact player going into this season, but a lot of Texas fans view Jaden Blue as the actual best overall back in the room. And Christian Clark, as a freshman, wasn't originally going to play much this season unless injuries happen and he goes down with the Achilles. Obviously, that doesn't help him at all. He's a player I really like. Torn Achilles to start your college career. It's just brutal. But what these running back injuries do is they really make you walk the tightrope in terms of running back health during the 2024 season. Because now you're down to what's really 3 scholarship backs. You're down to Jaden Blue. You're down to Trey Wisner, who's had very limited time at the running back position in his college career, and Jarrett Gibson, a freshman. If one of those guys goes down, you're really in emergency mode. What I'm hearing before we get into our previews for tonight, they're looking at a bunch of different options to just provide some depth at tailback. I've heard Ryan Niblett as a name that could be moving temporarily to running back. That would be an avenue for him to maybe get on the field earlier than we think, because right now at the wide receiver position, he's behind minimum 6 guys, the guys that we've mentioned over and over again. I've heard Juan Davis working kind of as an H-back, a bigger tight end. I don't know if he'd be your ball carrier, but he could be in goal line situations. I've heard Darian Gillette from linebacker has been getting some looks at running back. There are other options here that can kind of provide some depth, but it really forces you, if you're Texas, to walk the tightrope. Like Jaden Blue just turns into one of those guys that can't get hurt this year. I'm not to the point of these running back injuries affecting how I view the way this Texas season plays out. But if Jaden Blue was to suffer some kind of long-term injury, it would affect my outlook.
Right. Or
I
even
think,
short term at this point. If he misses week 2 against Michigan, that could change things as well.
yeah, I think that's really all that needs to be said on
Right.
that
Yeah.
situation. Let's go ahead and jump into our show tonight. We're going to start off. We're going to kind of alternate like we did last episode, hopefully going 15 minutes maximum on each of these team previews because we do have to get into the Texas secondary discussion. Let's start in Knoxville with the Tennessee Volunteers. Last year, really good season for a good, solid Tennessee program under Josh Heupel. They went 9-4, 4-4 in the SEC, finished third in the SEC East. This is obviously Josh Heupel, who was in the hiring cycle of same hiring cycle that was Steve Sarkisian. That I think it was 2021 hiring cycle in college football. At Tennessee, very successful, 27-12 over 3 years. And he's 55-20 in 6 years overall as a head coach. He's a really good, solid head coach. And when you look at the outlook for this Tennessee program going into this year with a 5-star freshman quarterback that I'm sure we'll talk a lot about, coming off a year before last year where they were the best offense in the country, where they put up 46 points per game and 525 yards. Those numbers dropped appreciably last year, but they still averaged 32 points per game and 448 yards. So they were still a very good offense. The ceiling people think rises with Nico Iamaleava, their 5-star freshman quarterback. That's obviously a big question of this college football season. But overall, this Tennessee season, in a lot of people's eyes, ranges anywhere from finishing in the top 4 in the SEC or top 5 in the SEC to finishing like 8th or 9th in the SEC. They could absolutely be vying for a playoff spot, but they could also just as well be like a 7 or 8 win team. There's a wide range of outcomes, much like we talk about in our NFL episodes with this Tennessee team. So, do you have any opening comments on Tennessee before we get into like what this roster looks like?
No. Let's get into this thing.
Why don't you start us off? What stands out to you about this roster? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What do you know about them?
Well, for the main thing, I think they've improved defensively with the additions to the transfer portal, and they're expecting some young talent to kind of improve from within as well, especially on the defensive line. So defensively, if they can kind of settle in at like a top 40-ish defense, kind of just complementary football, kind of opportunistic, if you will. Get a few turnovers here and there, get the ball back to your offense, add just raise the amount of possessions your offense gets, the amount of short fields, things of that nature. If you can do that, then this team is in position to be able to compete with just about anybody. And I don't say that lightly either. I think Nico, I'll just call him Nico, at quarterback, I think he'll come in and be able to give you B+ level college starting quarterback play. At the very least.
Here's my 3-minute summation of Tennessee's roster. I'll try to do this very quickly since we are kind of on a time crunch. We don't want this to drag into the 2-hour episode that was Sunday night. at the end of the day, Josh Heupel, to the casual college football fan in this offense, is going to steal the attention. To the people who aren't as plugged into the even the the two deeps of these college football rosters, they're going to get the spotlight, but this defense should not be overlooked. It's a defense that's coordinated by Tim Banks, who's done a very good job with this defense. Last year, they were able to make big strides in terms of their passing defense. Only allowing 222 passing yards per game. That was actually 64th in the country. Not bad at all compared to what Tennessee had been in the past. And they were 22nd in scoring defense. They were a top 25 total defense kind of team last year. And you mentioned it. I think where you start in terms of personnel is James Pierce, which headlines a very talented front seven for this Tennessee defense. James Pierce is a guy who was an all SEC edge last year, 10 sacks, 14 and a half tackles for loss. He had a strip sack and a pick six in the bowl win that they had last year. And when you look at consensus mocks for the 2025 NFL draft, he's one of the best defensive players in the draft next year. So we're looking for an all-American kind of season, provided that he's healthy, from James Pierce Jr. And I think he's kind of the headliner. But they have a 10 to 12 man rotation that they feel really comfortable with on this defensive line, even with a guy like Tyler Barron, who is a very good defensive end player for them leaving through the portal. They still have a lot of guys that they really like. Their top 5 defensive tackles all come back. Amari Thomas, who's a very solid starter. Elijah Simmons. They have a 5-star coming in, and or 5-star recruit coming back, and Davon Hobbs. Like, they feel really good about this front seven. I do too. The question is going to be, how does this secondary, I'm going to call it a retool. It's not a full rebuild, but a secondary retool manifest itself. How good are they in the secondary? How well does that group gel will be a big question. All 5 starters are gone from last year. They lose, Jalen McCullough. They lose Gabe Judy. Do you recognize that name? Gabe Judy was one of our high school for a brief minute. Like, he went to Canyon Ridge High School, and I think he was for a brief minute with Vandergrift before he moved. But he's playing big time college football, so good for him. They lose a lot from their secondary last year. 7 guys transferred out. So there's a lot of attrition there. They bring in a couple, like, group of 5 experienced starters. They bring in Jalen McMurray from Temple, and they bring in Jacoby Thomas from Middle Tennessee. That's a lot to be relying upon in the secondary. We'll see how it works out. But I think their front 7 is going to be spearhead this defense. And I still expect it to be a good defense. I think their defense is going to keep them in a lot of games. Offensively, I like what I see here. The concern is, you lose 2 of your top 3 backs, Jalen Wright and who was the other back that they lose? They lose Jalen Wright and Jabari Small, both off to the NFL. Jalen Wright was a guy who rushed for over 1,000 yards last year. Jabari Small was a contributor. So Dylan Sampson takes over at running back. And he was very good in the opener last year against Virginia, rushing for 4 touchdowns. And he actually had a pretty good season, but where's the depth in the backfield is a concern. I do like the receiver group. I think it's plenty good enough. Squirrel Wright returns. He was the leader in catches last year. Deontay Thornton, who transferred from Oregon in last year's cycle, returns. Brew McCoy is a question mark. He's coming off an injury, a gruesome ankle injury. but they bring in Chris Brazzell II. Learn that name. He could be a stud for this Tennessee offense. He's from Tulane, and he's 6'5". So he's kind of a freak. Hearing really good things out of Tennessee camp for him. Pretty much what I think this comes down to for Tennessee is Nico Iamaleava, the 5-star quarterback. And I think the schedule is actually pretty favorable for Tennessee. They have an early season non-conference neutral site game against NC State. NC State could be a sneaky team in the ACC this year. They have to play at Oklahoma in their first SEC game of the year. They've struggled against Florida for the longest time, for whatever reason. They do get Alabama. They get that at home, and we all remember what happened, last time Alabama played at Neyland. The goalpost got taken out of the stadium, and they threw it in the river after a big win. They actually do have to play at Georgia. So maybe it's not as favorable as I originally thought. But if Nico is the guy and this offense meshes, you can easily see them winning 9-10 games and being a playoff contender.
Yeah. Yeah, I see them as a fringe playoff team at best, and at worst, they could be 7 wins. It just really just depends on the offense this year. I think the defense is the side that has the floor, and I think the stability, where you're expecting improvement and there's actually a track record where you see a track where they're, a top 25 unit in the country again. But on offense, it's really a question mark because you're starting a true freshman at quarterback, regardless of whether he's a 5-star. We saw 5-star Dante Moore struggle over at UCLA last year. Like, you come in and you play right away. It's not easy, and this is the SEC we're talking about as well.
Yeah. If you're asking me the 3 guys I'm watching for Tennessee this year, 3 players. If you're a draft, maybe not Nico. He's obviously not going to be draft eligible. He's one guy that you're obviously watching, right? I mean, super recruited. And he accounted for 4 touchdowns in his only career start so far. Super talented. But beyond that, I think if you were to choose one guy on offense and one guy on defense, you absolutely want to keep your eye on this year. It's James Pierce on defense, who, as I mentioned, was an all-SEC kind of guy. One of the best defensive players in next year's draft. And then offensively, I'm keeping my eye on Brew McCoy, who's coming off an injury, but he was highly recruited. He had 52 catches back in 2022. But he is kind of the X factor on this Tennessee offense. Because if he's healthy, that just makes this Tennessee offense even more dangerous. He was a 2022 breakout player. So how he fares coming off a brutal ankle injury will be key.
Yeah, if he best case scenario, I could see him having like a Tez Walker type of season as like kind of a 5th-year college player. I think he's either in his 5th or 6th season. Not entirely sure on that, but kind of an older, more veteran-laden player. But all the talent in the world, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And then I'd also keep your eye on Chris Brazzell II. 6'5", 195. He can take the top off of defense. He had a 71-yard touchdown catch in their spring game. Caught 44 passes at Tulane. He could be a mismatch for that Tennessee offense. So I think this receiving room is deep. I really do. I think Nico has a lot of weapons. The real question for me for Tennessee is the secondary, because it's a totally remade secondary. 7 significant contributors for them a year ago, including all 5 starters, gone. So that will be a question mark, but I do think this Tennessee team is going to be a good football team. It's just those X factor games, the Alabamas, beating Florida, taking care of business at home, winning your non-conference, beating NC State, even though that's a solid program. They went 9-3 a year ago. It'll be Tennessee is like a wild card team in the SEC. If we were doing our NFL preview for the SEC, Tennessee is in the wide range of outcomes tier for me.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
All right. Ready to move on?
Yeah. So now we're going to take a break from team previews. We're going to talk about the Texas cornerbacks.
Yeah.
So,
and this is the segment that went long last time. If you watched our
we're
last
going to try
episode.
to keep this to like 15, 20 minutes. But why don't you start us off? Where do you want to start here?
I think the conversation definitely starts with the fact that this group was, I think, 100 and something in college football in pass defense.
Yeah.
Or I think it was in the 90s, but regardless, they really struggled against the pass last year, and they were kind of exposed, to be honest, against Washington, probably the best passing offense in college football last season, bar none. But coming into this year, it was a huge focus, and I think, in my opinion, this is a very positive outlook. But not one that I think is a hot take. I think this group could be a strength this season if things fall right. And I like Jalen Gilbo at the star position for this year. I like, obviously, Jahdae Barron coming back, playing a little bit more outside corner. Gavin Holmes, I feel very good about. But you also have a lot of depth. That's where I think the difference is this year. A lot of depth that you can trust. You've got, 3 different safeties you can rotate in there in different situations. And really, like, you can go with any combination of guys in that cornerback room, and you can feel pretty good about it. There's no real weak link, in my opinion, outside of maybe just like the super young freshman.
Yeah, I think the conversation for me starts with Malik Muhammad, who had a terrific debut as a true freshman cornerback last year. He kind of forced himself into the rotation at a position that was perceived to be locked down by veterans like Ryan Watts and Terrence Brooks. But with some of the struggles and how Malik Muhammad was able to play, he kind of cracked open the window of opportunity for him. Now, only 2 starts over 14 games last year. He kind of played in between whoever was healthy. Ryan Watts dealt with some injuries. It was kind of him and Terrence Brooks in a way for a while in the Texas cornerback room last year. But 479 snaps as a freshman, which was second amongst the team in terms of this room of cornerbacks. And he graded out as by far the best pass coverage defender of the entire group. 31 tackles. People are concerned or were concerned coming in about his kind of slim physical immaturity to a certain extent. But he's quickly become a really respectable run defender. I have all SEC, not even all SEC third team. Like, I have really high expectations, maybe unfairly so, but I have really high expectations of Malik Muhammad becoming a top 5 player on this team this year. I really think he can do that. He has all of the he might not have like the elite gross measurables. He does have long arms, which helps him. But he's got the anticipation. He's got the elite competitiveness. He's got the agility. He's got the coverage skills. He just doesn't have the elite size. I am really excited about Malik Muhammad. He could develop into a shutdown kind of corner, the guy that you can travel with the other team's number one receiver. Now, Texas doesn't really do that kind of stuff, but under PK, but he's kind of a shoo-in for me as long as he's healthy and being good in this secondary. Like, I don't think teams, when it's all said and done, are going to go into their games against Texas picking on Malik Muhammad. I don't think he's going to be the guy who might get picked on. And then Jahdae Barron's obviously another guy. He's another returner. Solid player. Here's what I'll say on Jahdae Barron. Like, I think his year 2 years ago was better than his year last year. What I'm looking for Barron, because he, in his time at Texas, he's been a very versatile player. You can move him around. He's going to play more outside corner this year. But he's a versatile in the fact that he's the best run defender in this secondary. Don't think it's particularly close. He's really good at sniffing out those screen passes. He's really aggressive. He's a good tackler. It's one of the reasons Texas defense was also very good in the run. Is they have a guy like Jahdae Barron, whose ability to recognize plays and blow them up around the line of scrimmage is one of his best qualities. He was third on the team in tackles last year. He suffered some injuries. But I think for Jahdae, the next step, because you're going to get an opportunity to see him at outside corner, is making some splash plays, taking the ball away. We heard about the scrimmage this past Saturday. He was forcing fumbles left and right. We need to see more of that from Jahdae Barron, or at least a little more of it. I'd like to see a couple more interceptions, being opportunistic, finding the football. But regardless, like he's a very good player, and he will get drafted into the NFL. It's just how high can he rise? Those are the two guys that return. And obviously, we're not talking about the safeties right now. We'll get to Derek Williams. We'll get to Mike Path. But Gavin Holmes is also a guy who comes back. I think when we see Texas line up on August 31st against Colorado State, the starting corners, barring something drastically changing in the next 2 weeks of practice, starting corners are going to be Malik Muhammad and Gavin Holmes. Just to start out. He transferred in from Wake Forest a year ago, got sprinkles of playing time when healthy. He's got long arms. He's got good lateral quickness. He's a good player. He's just, from a developmental perspective, similar to Malik Muhammad. He's not a very physically built, strong player. He can get sloppy and jams at the line of scrimmage. And he's not the greatest run defender. But I think overall he can be a solid player for Texas because he's an experienced player. I think he learned a lot from last year. He's out to prove something. And, he's played in 42 games in his career. So that's going to help him. That wealth of knowledge will help him going into this year.
Yeah, and the other thing I think about when it comes to Gavin Holmes is just flat out speed. If you look at, I guess, the fastest dudes you're going to face on this year's schedule, I feel like you feel pretty good about having Gavin Holmes on that guy. There's going to be some speed demons we play. There always is, especially in the SEC with the type of athletes that all of these teams have. But I think Gavin Holmes, it'll be interesting to see if that's the kind of role he plays, because it doesn't seem like he's the best in terms of change of direction and hip fluidity and things of that nature. So I think if you put him in a straight line contest, though, he's hip to hip with just about anybody in the country.
Those are the mainstays in this Texas cornerback room. Let's talk about the additions and kind of the wild cards. Javion Cole. In case you don't know who Javion Cole is, he was a late portal addition in the spring window from San Jose State. Texas is hoping that they found a dirty, neglected diamond in the rough here. He was very under-recruited as a high school prospect coming out. Under-recruited. He's an Oakland native. He's kind of undersized. 2-star recruit. Wasn't even a 3-star, but he made himself into one of the lockdown corners of the Mountain West last year. He was fantastic. He held his coverage victims to 26 catches on 53 targets for 297 yards, only surrendering 1 touchdown. He also had 3 interceptions, 10 pass breakups, which placed him 14th nationally overall out of all corners last year. So he's quite good in coverage. He's a very instinctual player. His awareness and his ability to, split his focus between the quarterback and the receiver's route as it develops is very good. He sees the field well. I think he can be a very good player, like one of the more impactful additions to the portal that Texas gets this year. My question becomes, is he going to be good enough to, say, take over Gavin Holmes' position as that corner opposite Manny Muhammad? That's the question I think a lot of Texas fans have. I think he's kind of in a battle with Gavin Holmes right now. He's really good in zone. He's just a really good player, like an 86.2 overall PFF grade and 697 snaps, the 19th overall best grade amongst cornerbacks across 133 FBS schools last year. Very good. He's just kind of like a lot of these other Texas corners, a little bit undersized, and he is taking a step up in competition. So that's Javion Cole. Any thoughts on him before we move on here?
Well, I just think, you hit on just about everything, but I do think there's a role for him in the NFL when he goes. Like, I think these undersized outside corners are becoming more and more prevalent in today's NFL. Like the Darius Williamses of the world, like they're very productive.
Yeah. I think the guy you're going to see push for that number 4 corner is going to be Kobe Black, who's a freshman. He kind of opposite of, say, Gavin Holmes, comes in with the size. He's got the size to be really special. He's 6'2". Let's see, what is his height and weight? At least coming in, I think it was 6'1", 6'2". Kobe Black. Where is he? Yeah, 6'2", 200 pounds. As a freshman at corner. That's good size. I think he'll back up Manny Muhammad. Hopefully nothing happens to Manny Muhammad, but he'll get some playing time. We'll get to see what he looks like. They have lots of young depth. The way that they've recruited the secondary, lots of young depth. Santana Wilson comes in this 2024 recruiting class, along with Jordan Johnson-Rubel. Wardell Mack is a freshman who's probably going to redshirt. A lot of those guys will probably redshirt this year. I could see Jordan Johnson-Rubel making an impact early on special teams. But Kobe Black, out of all the freshmen, is going to be the guy that you're watching for this Texas cornerback room.
Definitely.
All right. Are you ready to move back to team previews? Is that enough for the corners?
Yeah, I think so. You went really in depth there, so it wasn't much for me to say to add on.
Okay. Because I know we want to get out of here by like the 1 hour 15 mark ish. Maybe try to do sooner, but I think we're on a pretty good pace. So let's talk about LSU. Let's talk about the Tigers for a minute. Obviously, they have Brian Kelly as their head coach. In most polls, they're picked to finish 6th or 7th. I think in the SEC is where I kind of envision them.
Yeah, kind of behind Missouri, Texas, Georgia, Alabama,
Yeah.
maybe one other team.
Now, given where LSU was just 2 short years ago when Brian Kelly was hired, he's more than stabilized one of the sport's most powerful brands. That's what LSU is when they're at their best. Obviously, remember that in his first year, they beat Alabama. They won the SEC West. They played for an SEC championship game. They notched 10 wins. His second team last year got back to 10 wins. The story of last year, though, was they were 1-3 against the best of the best. The top 10 opponents that they faced last year, they were 1-3. But they did have an all-time offense, as we remember, with a Heisman-winning quarterback in Jaden Daniels and 2 excellent receivers, Brian Thomas Jr. and Malik Neighbors. They lose both those guys. We'll talk about how they replace those guys here in a minute. But a consistent theme of all of Brian Kelly's teams throughout his coaching career has been a breakthrough year in year 3, which is what this is for him at LSU. His first 2 years at Central Michigan were 10-12 before a 9-4 MAC conference title run. His third year at Cincinnati was a perfect 12-0 and a BCS bowl appearance, way back when they did the BCS system. And then the same deal at Notre Dame, 12-0 in the third season with the BCS national title invitation. So he's historically done very well in kind of this breakthrough year 3 year that is this for Brian Kelly. So we'll see where LSU is at. I'll pass it off to you, though, for some thoughts on where this LSU roster stands. What stands out to you in terms of where they sit right now in terms of their roster?
Yeah, it's not a Tennessee type of situation where you're bringing in a freshman, or even Oklahoma where you're starting a freshman. This is a guy who's been sitting for a couple years and has looked pretty good in the time he has gotten as a backup. And I also think with Brian Kelly at the helm, it does seem like their emphasis on kind of taking a step forward in the run game as well looks to be very promising going into this year. It's something they very much needed last year. They put a lot on Jaden Daniels' plate, and to his credit, he did deliver quite a bit. But defensively, they were absolutely awful. That's going to take a step forward. I think it would be pretty dang hard to stay the same or go backward just because of just how bad they were. I think just with the talent they have, they'll find some happy medium there. So I do like the overall roster, although I don't see them as having the ceiling of a Tennessee, even though that might be a bit of a hot take. I am a little bit higher on the ceiling of Tennessee.
Pick a stat. LSU was number 1 in it offensively last year. In the per game categories, whatever you want to mention, like scoring offense, number 1, points per play, number 1, total offense in terms of yards per game, number 1, yards per play, number 1, yards per carry, number 1, explosive rush plays, number 1.
Even like efficiency metrics.
Exactly. Like all of that. They were number one in offense. A lot of that had to do with Jaden Daniels, right? He shattered a wide range of NCAA records last year. You know, he was just fantastic. There's a reason he won the Heisman, obviously. He became the first quarterback in college football history to post 350 or more passing yards and 250 or more rushing yards in the same game. That's how electric he was. They lose two big-time weapons, as I mentioned, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. Those are two guys that combined for almost 3,000 yards and 31 touchdowns. So that's huge. Like, Neighbors led the nation in yards per game. We obviously have high expectations for him going into year one in his NFL career, even though opinions vary on how the Giants will do. We think Malik Neighbors will be a stud. And then Thomas was the nation's leader in receiving touchdowns. He was kind of their big play guy last year, 17 receiving touchdowns, and both were all Americans before being first-round picks. So even to more of an extent than Texas, but kind of in the same way as Texas, since that's my default comparison, since this is deep in the heart of Longhorn sports, they lose two guys that were drafted really highly. More so LSU than Texas, because both guys were first-round picks, and both guys were all Americans. The strength of this team, though, and the reason I still think they can be really good offensively is their offensive line.
Oh, yeah.
4 starters come back, just like Texas. They were the number one run-push offensive line last year. I think they're poised for potentially multiple All-Americans on this offensive line. Will Campbell is 1A or 1B in the tackle class next year alongside Kelvin Banks. You talk about Miles Frazier, you're talking about Emory Jones, and Garrett Dellinger on that offensive line, who all are coming back for a third year together, just like Kelvin Banks, Hayden Connor, Jake Majors, and to a lesser extent, DJ Campbell, but you get the point. I expect a really good offensive line. I expect them to take another step in pass protection. I think it's the top national offensive line. Nussmeier has had a lot of time to get right behind Jaden Daniels. He's had a lot of time to learn. I think given protection, given what we saw in the bowl game, although it is a bowl game, but 395 yards, a 98-yard touchdown winning drive in the final minutes. He left no doubt about him being the starter this year in that bowl game. I think he has the potential to push into the upper tier of SEC quarterbacks this year, given the protection he's going to get.
Yeah.
Now, LSU does call themselves wide receiver U for a reason. You know about all the elite wide receivers they've put into the NFL. You can make arguments for other schools, but I mean, you think of just about all the guys. They bring back Kyron Lacey. He was their number 3 a year ago. He now becomes kind of their number 1. He's a really good player. They bring in – who's the guy they bring in from the portal? They bring in C.J. Daniels off an 1,000-yard season at Liberty last year on their undefeated team, along with Xavier Thomas, who's a solid slot guy from the Mississippi State air raid offense. Like, I still really like this receiver room. I don't think they have an All-American in the receiver room anymore, but they still have very good players. And they've recruited very well at that position. And then running back is an interesting position. But I don't so much worry about it just because I think their offensive line is going to drive their running game. The big move offensively came at the top as Mike Denbrock, their longtime offensive coordinator, left to take the Notre Dame offensive coordinator job under Marcus Freeman. So he kind of co-hired within on that coaching staff, promote from within. He promoted the quarterbacks coach, I think, to offensive coordinator. We'll see how that plays out. That's kind of an X factor. Any thoughts on the offense before we talk about the defense a little bit and make our projection? for LSU?
Yeah, you mentioned the offensive line. I mean, to me, that's right there with Texas is, you know, top 3 unit in the SEC along with Georgia. I mean,
Yep.
and we talked about it with Texas a lot, but these teams are built from the inside out for a reason. Like the offensive line is just so important as like the bedrock of a team. And they're also improved on the defensive line too. So um, in terms of line play and controlling the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball, they'll be able to hold their own there. Or on offense, they'll be able to do a lot more than hold their own. But on
Yeah.
defense,
So defensively, where a lot of the questions are, just really fast. They fired Matt House and basically their entire defensive staff from last year. They had to make a change. Um, they were actually a top 10 unit back in 2022, and they fell to the bottom half of the SEC last year. They were horrible defensively. 118th in pass defense, even worse than Texas. 108 in yards per attempt allowed, 104 in opposing quarterback rating allowed, 107 in completion percentage allowed, 114th in explosive pass plays given up, and they were 87th in run defense. So, look, it was not a good defense a year ago. This year, the only way, really, as you mentioned, is up. How much up is it, though, is the question. They hired Blake Baker, who comes from the Missouri coaching tree, the Eli Drinkwitz coaching tree. He's a very good hire. I think they significantly upgraded this defensive coaching staff. I mean, Blake Baker turned Missouri from a horrible defense to a top 15 unit a year ago. I think his aggressive 4-2-5 attacking scheme will help this LSU defense. But really for LSU, it's about, for me, the fundamentals defensively. They have talent. I mean, Harold Perkins Jr. is an absolute freak. They have the talent. It's just tackling has been a huge issue for this LSU defense. And that's going to have to get significantly better. It remains to see if the overhaul in the coaching staff can produce tangible results there. So ultimately for me, correcting last year's defensive woes is a top priority. They still have a really good amount of offensive talent, despite the departure of several key components to the NFL draft, 3 of which in the first round. But they just can't give up 30 points in 8 games this year. That was unacceptable. The tackling was unacceptable. All of that has to get better for LSU ultimately to have another 10-win season, because that's been the standard under Brian Kelly.
right, right.
Anything else on LSU before we wrap up this show with second or safeties?
Nope, I think that's it.
Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do our safeties, and we're gonna wrap this thing up. No need to push it any further than about an hour-ish. Next episode, I think the next hole is going to be Sunday, hopefully. We're going to talk about Missouri, Alabama, and Ole Miss, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
But that'll be that. Okay. So Texas safeties. I can tell you're pretty tired, so let's just get through
Yeah,
this
sorry. Yeah.
fairly quickly. Where does your mind go first in terms of the Texas safety room?
I
Derek Williams?
think we've got Derek Williams, 5-star, obviously, a guy we're going to be putting in there as a potential breakout star. You see a lot of guys, really take that leap from year 1 to year 2. That's a big deal in college football. So, but Derek Williams in particular, man, so much talent to tap into there. But you have the veterans, of course, and Makuba from Clemson, and then Taff, who
Yeah.
has been a heat-seeking missile, from what I've
Yep.
heard in a training camp here. Which, from running back point of view, keep him away from the running backs. But everybody else, they can have all the smoke.
Yeah, so Derek Williams, he's the number one guy, much like Malik Muhammad is at corner. He was, really quickly ascended to being pretty much a starter, especially later on in the season for Texas last year. 42 tackles as a safety. As a run defender is where he really impressed me. He was second overall to only Ryan Watts as a secondary run defender last year. And he was reasonably solid against the pass given his inexperience. And I think he's only going to get better there. You love his frame, 6'2", 195, 200-ish. I think he's going to get stronger this year. I think he's going to be stronger this year. I think he's physical enough to drop down to the box. And I think he's good at supporting the run. It's just all about, how much of a disruptor can he be from that safety position in terms of pass coverage. Michael Taff it's really one of the better stories on this entire roster. Fourth year, and he was a walk-on from Westlake High School in Austin. He's an Austin guy, easy to root for. 27 appearances in his Longhorn career, but last year was really where he kind of forced himself into a starting role with these safeties, given, kind of the liabilities that were the guys who have departed the program to a certain extent. But regardless, 48 tackles, he had a blocked punt, he contributed on special teams, 3 interceptions, which was actually tied for the team lead. He was making plays last year. I think he's just a significantly above average college football player, good starter with excellent instincts, solid range, reliable. He's just reliable. He's the kind of veteran guy you look to. He's not going to make many mental mistakes. He might not have the athleticism or the size, or he might not be as gifted as Derek Williams or a lot of these other guys, but he's not going to make many mental mistakes, and he's a willing hitter. He's going to be physical, and he's less of a liability than Keaton Crawford was. No offense to Keaton Crawford, but wish him the best. But he was not particularly helpful in pass coverage last year. So, yes, I really like Michael Taff, and then kind of the guy you're hoping that can emerge in a big role for this secondary because of how hard Texas went after him in the portal is Andrew Makuba. He was an addition at the expense of Dabo Sweeney, who doesn't use the portal at all. We know that running joke. He's also an Austin native, 3-year starter for the Tigers. He was 31 career starts. He's played at a really high level. Also gives you the versatility to play him at nickel. Now, I don't know how much time Andrew Makuba is going to get at nickel, given you can play Jahdae Barron there and you can play Jalen Gilbo there. So I think he's going to be more of a safety for the Texas team. But his flexibility is absolutely a strength. And I think just like how he is, extremely fluid, can adjust to the ball, play man at a pretty high level. doesn't make many mistakes, is something this Texas team needs. Like they just needed brain trust in the secondary. He brings experience. Again, the theme for this Texas secondary is you want to see them make more splash plays. That's the one thing I'm looking for going into this year. Because a lot of pressure is on. I'll kind of wrap it up with this. A lot of pressure is on Blake Gideon and Terry Joseph to get this secondary right, to get these position groups right going into this year. Or else, as we know under Sark, he's very willing to make changes if things aren't going the way he wants them to. See the wide receiver coach when he was hired. The hire of Andre Coleman did not work out whatsoever. So what they do? They go and get Brennan Marion. And now they have Chris Jackson. Like he will make changes on his staff if he has to. And with the tight circle that Sark keeps, he kind of, if he doesn't trust you anymore, he's not gonna hesitate to make changes. So I think not all of what happened last year was on the coaching staff.
Yeah.
But there is pressure on the coaching staff. So
For sure. Yeah, and I think some of the things we talked about like during the season too is just like the depth at that spot and just the continuity in terms of understanding the coverages that were actually being called was just not there.
yeah.
And this year, like, I just don't expect that to be an issue in the slightest.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. Anything else we need to mention? Like what for you is the one thing you're looking for from this secondary in 2024? Is there like a specific thing you want to see them do or achieve in
Um,
2024?
I just want to see, like, for me personally, I don't care if you get beat. Like, as a corner, as a defensive back, you're gonna get beat. Um,
Yeah.
to me, it's more about the mentality you have and like just I want to see them get up into people. Like, and I know some of this was the scheme, so it's not on them. But there was too many times where it was 3rd and 3, and you're playing 8 yards off the ball, and you're given a 4 yard curl route. Things of that nature. I think it's an upgrade of talent at the corner spots this year. So I think we'll be able to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of the style of coverage. And I also think the pass rush has gotten better. So you're able to kind of balance those two things out too. So it's a combination of both.
Yeah. I would agree with that. So leave us in the comments. What are your expectations for this Texas secondary in 2024? How much do you think it improves? Who do you point the finger at if it doesn't? Are you moving on from Blake Gideon? Are you moving on from Terry Joseph if you're Sark? And who do you think emerges as kind of the number 2 corner? Do you think it's Javion Cole? Or do you think it's Gavin Holmes who excels in that area? Or maybe it's Jahdae Barron. Who knows? Those are some questions for this Texas secondary. Before we wrap this thing up, there was some news today with the release of the NBA schedule. I'm sure you maybe saw that, right?
A little bit, yeah.
I haven't looked at it too much in depth, but some tangentially related Longhorn news that I'm going to share right now, in case you haven't seen it, is as part of the 2024-25 NBA schedule. Let me share my screen real fast. this was something I saw because it does involve my team, the San Antonio Spurs. Kevin Durant's going to be returning to Austin to play an NBA game on campus at the Moody Center.
Oh wow.
He's going back to Austin. The Suns are going to play the Spurs at the Moody Center on February 20th at 8:30. That'll be Kevin Durant once again playing on the University of Texas's campus, assuming that he's healthy. Let's pray and hope that he's healthy then.
Yeah.
But I'm now considering going to that game. I will be seriously considering going to that game. Kevin Durant playing at the University of Texas. I thought that was some cool Texas-related news. And the game, if you can't make it, will be on TNT, 9:30 p.m. Eastern time. So that was an exciting news dump today in Longhorn land, along with the rest of the NBA schedule. And by the way, I think the Spurs open up in Dallas, from what I saw.
Ooh, again.
And another exciting part, again, for me, that's not good. For you, it's exciting given what Luka does to the Spurs time and time again. The other exciting part for me, though, was the Spurs got a Christmas game this year.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They're going to get now they're playing the Knicks in Madison Square Garden as the early game on Christmas, but they haven't had a Christmas game in like 8 years. So
yeah,
that's exciting.
Okay,
And then my Steelers play the Chiefs on Christmas night. So that's going to be a day.
Ooh.
So that'll be interesting.
Boy.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. Emmy, any Longhorn-related parting shots? It can be about the football team.
Parting shots. I would say check out our last episode Sunday. It was a long one, but I would say fast forward to like the last 45 minutes or so. We were like basically just talking Texas that entire last bit of it. So definitely do that. Other than that, though, don't really have much.
I have some things to discuss with you off camera, but that's going to do it for this episode of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you are you didn't get to Missouri. If you are a Tennessee and or LSU fan, tell us what are your expectations for those two teams. We covered them in this episode. Last episode, we covered A&M and Oklahoma. So we're getting into the depths of the SEC. This is our first year in the SEC. And we can all agree this is a lot more fun than talking about Iowa State and TCU and Kansas State. It just is.
Yeah.
No offense. A lot of those programs are solid programs, but this is the SEC, and we're super excited about it. Next episode, expect more SEC content along with more SEC content. So for Michael Wein, he's Emmy Nixon, and we'll see you guys on Sunday night for another edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. Until then, keep your horns up, hook 'em, and peace.